I'm a secular conservative, and it seems like there's a lot of confusion over exactly what that entails. I get accused by liberals of all kinds of things that are absurd because I don't approach my conservatism from a religious bent. They say that because I might wind up ostensibly on their side of the fence, that somehow I'm a liberal, but I don't see it that way. Because I think that how you get to a position is at least as important as the position you hold. And I get to my positions conservatively. I just don't have that emotional reaction and adopt positions because they feel good. I do so intellectually and rationally. And frankly, I don't think that either the political left or the religious right does that as often as they should, and that's a problem. So today, exclusively for my VidMe audience, I thought I'd start off with one of the most controversial topics out there, abortion. Mostly, you got people on the far left who are pro-choice, and people on the far right who are absolutely against it for religious reasons. But once you take religion out of the picture, it really doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Therefore, I'm going to spend some time trying to explain what position I've come to and why I've come to it. And this is something I've tried to do in the past on various topics, and I don't think I've ever been particularly successful because these ideas are not really amenable to being explained in a short video. I once did a survey and found that most of my audience wanted 10 to 15 minute videos at the longest, and they started to lose interest once I went on for more than that. I mean, I don't necessarily mind making longer videos, but if no one wants to watch them, what's the point? So I typically don't bother, and that means I've had to compress things and skip things that I think are important, and therefore I haven't really been able to express myself as I might in either a written article or a longer video. But I'm going to try again on this issue. Now, abortion's actually a strange subject because while I am pro-choice out of necessity, I wouldn't choose abortion personally, except in the case of fetal deformity or the health of the mother. There may be other extreme cases where it would be acceptable, but otherwise, I'm pretty much personally anti-abortion for myself and my wife, even though we're way too old to have to worry about it anymore. And in a perfect world, I'd be that way for everyone. See, in a perfect world, no one would engage in risky sex outside of a long-term, mutually monogamous, responsible relationship. In a perfect world, people would never get pregnant out of wedlock. They would have access to effective birth control that would stop pregnancy except when it was optimal. Every child would be a wanted and planned child. People would be responsible for their actions and would take responsibility for their lives, even if what happened wasn't exactly optimal. But that's not the world that we live in, and we have to accept reality as it actually is, not as we wish it was. And for that reason, abortion is something that has to be available, even if it's not preferable. A woman has the right to control her own body just as a man does. Individual freedom is important. But so too is individual responsibility. And unfortunately, I think a lot of that responsibility has been lost in the modern Western world. We get freedom for the sake of being free, and people are not held accountable for the decisions that they make, good or bad. Except freedom doesn't really make any sense without responsibility. As the great philosopher Peter Parker once said, with great power comes great responsibility. Your actions do affect others, and if you're never held responsible for your actions, you have no reason to care about the harm that you cause to those around you. Largely, people have stopped caring about that harm, especially if you hurt the ones that are invisible to you. When you've got your hand out for tax money, you don't see all of the people pulling that money out of their pockets and handing it over. You never have to deal with the individuals, so most people really don't care, except when they're the ones expected to fork that cash over to Uncle Sam. Then they complain a lot, and they should. But tax money and financial support, all of those things are inherently finite resources. You have no right to them if it isn't absolutely necessary. And to bring this back around to abortion, people who have children they can't afford, or people who want medical procedures that they can't afford to pay for, they're both costing the taxpayer money in welfare and other socially provided expenses. Where the hell do you get off thinking someone else has to pay for you? Now, of course, on the other side of the fence, you have delusional people who think that there's an imaginary man in the sky watching what you do in the bedroom and demanding that you have as many children as you can, whether you can afford to pay for them or not. And I find these people disgusting. There simply is no right to pop out as many babies as you can, like your vagina's a clown car. You know, we've actually discovered through extensive scientific research what causes pregnancy. Rent a clue. If you can't afford to pay for the children that you have, don't have them. And that goes for people who are religiously delusional and people who want a bigger welfare check every month. It goes for morons who think that if they just get pregnant, then their man of the week won't go find somewhere else. And they're almost always wrong. All of these people are being irresponsible. They're not thinking through their decisions. In fact, they're usually not thinking at all. They're just reacting emotionally. Being hyper-emotional is one of the most toxic things you can do, both as an individual and to a society. These people are demonstrably harming others, both taxpayers and society as a whole, through their irresponsibility. Why in the world do we allow this? Now, of course, none of this applies to things like rape or incest. People who get into trouble through no fault of their own deserve our help, and I'm not going to complain about tax money being spent to help people who got screwed over, no pun intended. Don't go thinking I'm heartless toward legitimate victims of sexual violence, because I'm not. As I said earlier, in a perfect world, which of course we don't inhabit, there would be no rape, no incest, no sexual crime. And that's something we have to fight against on a daily basis, and we should. In fact, I don't think we penalize sexual predators nearly enough. But that's something for a different video, isn't it? But what about adoption? I mean, that's something I see coming up from the religious all the time. Don't let anybody have an abortion, make them give birth, and then find somebody else to adopt the baby. Okay, let's look at the actual evidence to see if any of this makes sense. National statistics only get published once every couple years, so we're going to have to go back to at least 2014 to find the most recent statistics. The fact is, we're finding that fewer people today are adopting than in the past. Between 2008 and 2012, there was a 14% decrease in the total number of adoptions in the US. In fact, we're seeing an increasing rate of decrease as time goes on. And it's not because people are adopting from overseas. That peaked in 2004. There just aren't as many adoptive households out there at the moment. So, how many children are currently in foster care awaiting adoption? Going back to 2014, there were 415,129 children as of September of that year, and that's a 4% increase from the 2012 numbers. Of the children that left foster care, only 21% were adopted by someone other than their natural family. Therefore, there are a ton of kids already in the system who need adoptive parents. Now, if we look at abortion statistics, the most recent year I can find being 2013, there were 664,435 abortions performed. So if we eliminate abortion, that adds more than 664,000 unwanted kids to the foster care system. Where the hell do you get the crazy idea that you can find homes for all of them when you can't even find homes for the hundreds of thousands of kids that we already have in the system? Are you mental? Well, no, they're not. They're emotional, and emotion has very little place in setting national policy. It's simply insane to think that adding more than 500,000 unwanted children to the foster care system every year would result in anything but disaster. So eliminating abortion, while it might be an admirable goal, is simply not a rational position to take. You just can't get from there to here. So, what do? I mean, certainly we can work toward a more responsible populace, but that takes time, and honestly, most people don't want it. It's a controversial position to be sure, but I firmly believe that conservatism builds nations and liberalism breaks them down. When life is hard, people tend to be conservative and focus on traditions that have demonstrably worked in the past. When life's easy, when people have lots of money and time and resources, they tend to look outward to spend money on things other than survival. That's not a bad thing to be sure, but when it goes too far, it's dangerous. It simply ignores the requirement for people to be responsible and just hands out checks for bothering to get out of bed in the morning. And that's not a good way to run a society. And that's really what I'm concerned about. Humans are an inherently social species. We need other people to survive, especially in the modern world. The health and well-being of that society needs to be of primary concern for all of us. Because if it all comes crashing down, all the individualism in the world won't stop you from ending up in a Mad Max scenario. And newsflash for you, you're not going to wind up as Lord Humongous of the Wasteland. You're going to be toady and get smashed underfoot. So while individual rights are important, they can't detract from our responsibilities to society, and that's something I see a lot of people on the political left pretending. Now, I'm all for individual rights, so long as those rights don't get in the way of individual responsibilities, which happens way too often, in my opinion. But anyway, I keep getting away from the core subject because all these positions are inherently linked. Now, another thing that I support, but the liberal left in particular despises, is the ability of men to get out of their parental responsibilities. If a woman can do it via abortion, why should they get special privileges? Why should men get treated like a walking wallet for 18 years if a woman can go get an abortion and have no further responsibility? It makes no rational sense. I figure that a man ought to be welcome to end his parental responsibilities for a pregnancy, so long as it's done before a particular point in the pregnancy, prior to the third trimester, for example, and he must be informed at least 15 days prior to that point. If he's not, then he could just end his obligation within 15 days of being informed. If the mother never tells him, he never has any responsibility. In so doing, he has to fill out the proper legal forms, and he has to pay a fee, which I always figured was as much as an abortion cost in the area, and he was off the hook. The money went to the mother, who could decide what she wanted to do with it, knowing that she would never receive another penny from the father. Actions have consequences. The father gives up any right to ever see the child, at least until the child is an adult, and then they can seek out the father if they want. And the mother knows that whatever decision she makes, she will be solely responsible for all costs associated with raising the child. And she shouldn't have the option to seek out welfare. She has to pay for it on her own, as all people should. But of course, fixing welfare, that's yet another video for another time, I guess. I've yet to see how any of this is at all unfair. It's just a shame that you have ideology, what you think ought to happen, and then you have reality, what can actually work in the real world. In this case, the two simply do not coincide. I hope that someday they might, but I don't see that happening anytime soon. We're on a long slide into stupidity today, led by those on the far political left. And it's going to take a sharp drop before actual conservatism, and secular conservatism hopefully, can start to rebuild us into some semblance of sanity. Unfortunately, I gave up debating abortion a long time ago because people on both sides can't do so intellectually. It's all emotion. So I get screamed at by the religious right, and I get screamed at by the liberal left. And what's the point of that? It's a fight that you just can't win, so why bother trying? So now we come to the interactive portion of our program. What do you think? Let me know your comments, questions, and criticisms, but make sure that you do it rationally. Whining emotionally will just get you ignored. I don't care what you feel. I care what intellectual position you've come to using logic, reason, and critical thinking. If those are not your friends, this is not the channel for you. So let's go ahead and have an intelligent discussion about a sometimes difficult topic. I don't want to hear, think of the children. I want to hear a rational argument based on evidence and the real world about how things not only ought to be, but how to actually get there. Now this ought to be fun. Who wants to go first?